Overcoming by purefoysgirl. Chapter 20. Will's form was a small smudge in the distance by the time Hannibal collected himself enough to head home. Terrified he would find his spouse lifeless in the lane along the way, sick and frightened as he was. The staff assured him that Will had, indeed, made it home in one piece, though he was so ill that Mr. Price and Francis had taken him upstairs at once, according to Mr. Hawkes's agitated recounting of the moment. It left Hannibal vastly relieved on that count, at least, knowing Will made it home and was in good hands. Grandfather caught sight of him as he came in, and wheeled toward him from the east wing, shouting,
"What on earth have you done to him now? You should be horsewhipped."
"Will saw to that already," Hannibal wearily said, concerned by the state Will was in.
"Ha! Serves you right, you ingrate. Someone needs that arrogance taken down a few pegs."
Hannibal scowled at him and took the stairs 2 at a time, Grandfather calling admonishments up after him. He could smell the faint, foul stink of Francis Dollaride on the landing, and it ratcheted up his agitation higher, the presence of the other Alpha a threat that Hannibal could barely stomach. It was all he could do not to barge his way into Will's suite and get some answers, but that would do more harm than good, he knew. Will was in Jimmy's faithful hands, and that was, perhaps, the best thing for both of them right now. He slammed into his room instead, and started stripping his jacket and waistcoat off, still feeling shocked at how Will had flogged him away as if he'd been in mortal danger.
"You could have been killed. Isn't that what you're after?"
Terror. The sent memory of it prickled Hannibal's sinuses, his heart rate picking up and his stomach tightening. Will's violence had always intrigued Hannibal, but even he knew that Will striking someone with a riding crop was the last resort of a very desperate kind of fear. He'd stank of blind fright in that sweet, elusive something that had acted like icy water on Hannibal's own reactions. Something about him made his mate fear for his life, and the fault lay in himself. He had never taken the time to know Will, had never attempted to befriend an Omega or understand one. He was essentially as unschooled in Omegas as a toddling babe, his father's concubine and Bedelia's instructions notwithstanding. All he really knew was that he had somehow goaded his mate into lashing out on the lane. And he needed to know why. A mute knock at the door admitted Berger, silent and leery, and clearly expecting to find him in a temper.
"Fetch my bag down,"
Hannibal ordered him, moving to the mirror to inspect the damage Will had done. It would scar, this livid, bruised and bloodied mark on his cheek. He was lucky Will had only used force enough to check him, else the damage might have cost him an eye. But he could hardly begrudge him, considering the scars he had left on Will. Marks on the heart showed in different ways than those on the skin, but were, Hannibal knew, no less painful a reminder of the injury that caused them. Hannibal looked thoughtfully at the closed door to the washroom, becoming aware of the faint sounds of water as his mate moved within, and the light tones of Jimmy's voice as he assisted his master. It reminded Hannibal of when he'd burst in on Will and surprised him from the tub. He'd been as delicate and beautiful then as he'd been ablaze with righteous indignation and outrage on his horse, wielding that crop like a soldier with a saber, but no less beautiful. Beautiful, but terrified all the same.
"Would you like me to stitch you?" Berger offered. "I would like to start this day over entirely. Inform Jimmy that I wish to have a discussion with Will when he is dressed."
He dearly hoped that by then they both would be a little more calm.
"In his suite, my lord, or yon?" "He can choose, it's no matter to me, but tell him I wish to speak with him immediately,"
Hannibal said, shooing Berger out on his way. Trembling with the loss of the adrenaline that had flooded him, he collected his supplies from his bag and returned to the mirror, grateful for the pain of washing and repairing the wound on his cheek that forced him to pull himself back under control, to recall Will's condition and how he behaved. Broken ribs, perhaps, bruised at best, and definitely a concussion, and he knew too well how brutal even one of those could be, let alone a combination. He chafed to examine Will and settle his mind that there was nothing terribly wrong, to have a chance to speak to him about what had happened, to hear him give voice to his fears so that Hannibal could address them. He took a deep breath and snipped off the thread before inspecting the tidy, small stitches holding his tanned skin together. He began to carefully put his tools away, only half aware of Will in the washroom, only half aware that his anxiety for his mate was turning his senses toward him. But when the faint slosh of water was accompanied by a pained, nearly inaudible noise of distress, that very awareness sent Hannibal bursting through the door before his mind caught up with his immediate response. Will, teetering in an attempt to get out of the tub, immediately dropped back into the sudsy water up to his chin, blue eyes wide and alarmed and fixed on Hannibal with sharp anxiety. "Do not come any closer, Lord Clarges!" "I heard you cry out," Hannibal said, feeling guilty when Will looked up at him, blue eyes wide with mingled fear and fury. "You're dizzy, aren't you? And it's getting worse?" "Please leave me alone," Will said, his breathing shallow as he fought the nausea his sudden movement had inspired, the walls of the washroom seeming to tilt and run together quite alarmingly. "And let you lose consciousness in the bath? I will embarrass the both of us before I allow that, Will." "Hannibal, I am warning you, considering there is very little within reach you can fling at me," Hannibal said, kicking the small vanity stool over to settle it next to the tub.
"I believe this is my opportunity to expect you to behave rationally and get some answers."
Will's cheeks colored at that, and he glowered, wrinkling his small, perfect nose and once more lamenting the lack of locks on the doors. "You can hardly be said to have behaved rationally where I am concerned. I sought a hot bath to seek relief, Lord Clarges. Do not mitigate what little headway I've made by badgering me. Get out!" He tensed in the tub, aching muscles screaming their reluctance, but he was not about to take any chances, vulnerable position that he was in. Hannibal, for all he knew, might just take it into his head to hold him under until the bubbling stopped and be done with it at last. Settle things, as he'd put it.
"When I said you might have been killed, you responded by asking if it wasn't what I was after. Why would you say such a thing? Why are you so frightened of me?"
Hannibal demanded, entirely ignoring the jibe, all grace and good manners abandoned to the alpha urge to unearth the source of this problem and deal with it. He tasted Will's fear like ash on his tongue, the sharp scent of it strengthening despite being immersed in water, and said,
"No, allow me to amend that. Why are you so frightened of me?"
"I am not—"
"Don't you dare lie to me now when you have never before. I want the truth of it, Will. You were terrified of me, so terrified, in fact, that you whipped me with your crop, something I know even a violent termagant such as yourself would normally hesitate to do. Did you honestly believe that I was going to hurt you?"
"You grabbed me! I have no idea what you are capable of," Will told him, stiff with tension. His hands rose to grip the sides of the tub, knuckles turning white with force as if he was bracing for attack.
"I only know what you have shown me, which has not been kindness,"
Hannibal finished for him, chuffing a short, sharp bark of unhappy laughter. He spied Jimmy peeking in through the washroom door, but the valet closed it again under Hannibal's dark glare.
"Will, I am being entirely serious with you. I want to know what I have done to make you so fearful of me."
Will looked down at the water, the goose-egg lump on his forehead painfully stark where his wet hair parted around it. Not all of the tension around his mouth and eyes came from his fear, Hannibal knew. He was in a good deal of pain, and Hannibal wanted very much to soothe it from him.
"Will,"
he said again, softening his tone, wishing he could convey his sincerity to his spouse as bonded couples were said to do.
"Please. You spoke of my intentions toward you. Have I given you some reason to believe that I mean you harm?"
"Shall I list the ways in which you have shown yourself a less than caring spouse?" Will asked, blue eyes lifting slowly with great respect for the worsening headache he risked. "Or even remind you that you have treated me abominably?"
"My memory is not lacking in that respect, Will. I am aware of how badly I've treated you,"
Hannibal said, having the good grace to blush.
"Yet I've hardly threatened to kill you."
Will's eyes rounded, and he drew into a little ball of outraged fury that made Hannibal stare at him with growing shock.
"Will,"
he pressed, unable to believe that his young spouse had reason to think he might actually do him deadly harm.
"when have I ever threatened your life?"
Will's chin tipped up, familiar stubborn tenacity rising to the fore. With a tone that spoke very much of resignation to circumstances, Will said, "You told the Duke. Take him off of my hands before I arrange an accident for him. My first night under your roof, when you were forced to share a table with me." It was Hannibal's turn to be speechless. He gaped at Will, who gazed up at him with glittering assessment in his dark blue eyes. And then he uttered a sharp, aghast laugh at how foolish it was, how ridiculously misplaced Will's fears were.
"What a lot of silly nonsense," he decided, shaking his head, another harsh, unhappy laugh escaping him. "Where has this come from so suddenly? Will, you're far too intelligent to make a mountain out of that particular molehill. I was speaking out of anger. 6 years have passed since then. You can't expect me to accept that could make you believe I would kill you, Will. Honestly, there was nothing at all laughable or accidental about cutting the girth strap on my saddle," Will said, the pain in his sharp tone bringing Hannibal's scolding to a cold halt. "Nor in pushing me down the stairs." It took Hannibal a moment to let the implications of that sink in. He stared at Will, who seemed very small and very vulnerable, braced in the bath, as if expecting he might not ever leave it alive, his blue eyes large and mournful in his flushed, lovely face, the wet tips of his curls dripping water down his cheeks. "Excuse me, what did you just say?"
"Why pretend it didn't happen?" Will asked, slumping a little, his bare throat tight with tension, full mouth curving in a smile that was absolutely divorced from happiness. It was rueful and broken, and Hannibal never wanted to see such an expression on his face ever again. Ever. "We both know my girth strap was tampered with the day I fell, in the hopes that I would break my neck, and you know as well as I do that I didn't fall down those stairs." Heat flooded Hannibal's veins, and he surged to his feet, protective anger swelling in him, fit to make him burst. It did not escape his notice that Will flinched from him, no doubt thinking he would drown him there in the tub.
"Will,"
he said, struggling to contain his growing upset and anger,
"are you telling me someone sabotaged your saddle?"
"You hardly need to be told such a thing. You barely waited a full day before trying to kill me."
"I did nothing of the sort!
Why in the 7 hells would you even believe such a thing?
What on earth gave you that idea?"
"I received a letter claiming to have been privy to the attempt," Will said, pressed back into the deeper end of the tub, both to hide his nudity beneath the cloudy water and make it harder for Hannibal to force him under. "And Matthew showed me the girth strap. I could see for myself it had been cut."
"Cut!"
Hannibal echoed, swiping his hand down his face, pacing like a caged animal with the force of his growing agitation.
"Why would I have ever done such a thing? When would I have ever done such a thing?"
"You tell me!" Will snarled, Hannibal's forceful alpha posturing filling him, as if his husband's anger belonged to him. Perhaps it did belong to him, some portion of it. He certainly felt angry, enraged, ready to shout back just as fiercely as he was shouted at. Let no one ever say Will Graham went down without a fight. "You have loathed me from the day you set eyes on me. It is not entirely outside of the realm of possibility that you have twice tried to kill me. But I warn you now, Hannibal, the 3rd time you had better make certain you have succeeded, or I will not answer for what happens next."
"There will be no 3rd time!"
Hannibal shouted, the throbbing alpha undertone of his deep voice bouncing off the decorative tin ceiling and reverberating through Will's chest. He swung around and pinned Will with incredulous amber eyes, such perfect horror written in their depths that Will almost questioned himself.
"There was never a single time!"
He took a dragging breath, struggling to control himself, and Will mirrored him, panting and tense.
"Even were I the kind of man who could coldly murder an innocent person in my home,"
Hannibal said, a harsh thread of true fear ringing in his voice like the somber tone of a church bell,
"I did not sabotage your saddle, and I most certainly did not push you down the stairs. I sleep like the gods' own dead, Will. Had the servants not come pounding down the hall, I might not have woken at all."
"If it wasn't you, then who?" Will demanded, challenging him, his smaller Omegan fangs bared in a snarl. "I saw whoever was there in your room, Hannibal. I called after them and they ran. When I started to follow, you came from the shadows and pushed me." Hannibal stopped pacing abruptly.
"Whoever was in my room? You think I had someone with me? Absolutely not. Whatever you saw outside of your room—"
"Outside of your room," Will corrected, bewildered by Hannibal's reaction. He could feel pure, unadulterated, protective rage swelling through his bond to Hannibal, so great, in fact, that it was almost overpowering. It was as if every word he spoke merely goaded Hannibal to greater upset. Upset that seemed strangely enough, to be on Will's behalf. It threw Will off kilter, and that only worried him all the more, that his bond might be twisting his perception to favor Hannibal when he should do nothing of the sort.
I cannot honestly believe what I'm hearing. I honestly cannot believe what you are telling me.
Will took advantage of Hannibal's pacing to pull the plunger from the tub and reach for a bathing sheet to cover himself as the cloudy water drained. "Am I a liar now as well, Hannibal?" he asked, bundling himself into the smooth material of the sheet, hiding his bare body behind the shield of the tub's side while he did so. He trembled in the cool room from nerves and chill, his sudden movements making his whole body ache in outrage.
"No, you are not a liar. If there is one thing in this world I can rely on, Will, it's your brutal honesty. What I cannot believe is that you have kept this to yourself. Someone has tried twice to kill you, and I cannot even try to protect you because you have said nothing. Even knowing there had been one attempt already to kill you, you still found it beholden upon yourself to confront an intruder in our home. Why, for the sake of all the gods?"
"I have never had reason to fear for my safety inside my own house before," Will responded, the sharp edge of his anger subsiding as Hannibal's panic receded, the smallest kernel of doubt taking hold. "Why shouldn't I go check when I hear someone creeping about in the hall?"
"It did not ever occur to you to wake me?"
Hannibal asked, pausing in his pacing to pin Will with a glare, his hackles rising even at the idea of a stranger being in his home, his territory, within threatening distance of his.
"Well, certainly you had been sleepwalking when you shoved me down the stairs," Will said, clutching the bathing sheet close when Hannibal advanced on him. "I will say it once more, Will. I did no such thing. This is why you are terrified of me? You've thought I've tried twice to kill you, and that I was going to, what? Drag you from your mare's back and squeeze the life out of you on the lane to Hartford?"
"Yes," Will said, trembling but not backing down. "Why shouldn't you? It would certainly make things easier."
"Easier on whom, pray tell?" Hannibal asked, gesturing wildly. "What would I gain by it? The probability that you have left your worldly belongings to your father? The very real possibility of losing Hartford House forever, if we prefer to be as cold as you believe I am?"
Will stared at him, his pain-clouded mind seizing on what his husband had said, perfectly reasonable arguments he'd been too nervous and uncertain to consider before now. It cracked his surety like a shell, and left him adrift on sudden, frightening doubt.
"This is entirely beyond my comprehension. You are only now telling me your saddle was tampered with. There is an intruder, no, 2 intruders in our home, one of whom pushed you down the stairs, no doubt fully intending you not survive. And then, when you do manage to survive, you don't tell me about it. Gods, I cannot remember ever being so angry. Why on earth didn't you come to me so—"
"Because I didn't wish to meet the same fate as the former Lady Clarges." Hannibal drew back as if he'd been hit with something much more painful than a crop, and Will felt his stomach sink, his bond to Hannibal giving him nothing but pain. Hannibal's amber gaze fastened on Will, eyes wide and horrified and showing profound hurt that was nearly as palpable as the bond itself.
"Murdered, you mean?"
he asked, his mouth curled in a wry, unhappy smile.
"Do you imagine I drowned her in the bath, as you seem to believe I intended to do to you?"
Will swallowed hard, clinging to the tub with one hand, the seam of the sheet with the other, staring at his husband, who seemed equally as devastated as he was hurt.
"I can only infer from what little I have found—"
"Which is nothing," Hannibal said, the echo of the alpha growl in his voice dying in the resulting silence. Will sat still and alert, but not cowering, not with that much steel in him.
"What version of the story have you heard? That I seduced her? Tired of her, that I threw her from the parapets in a rage?"
"You cannot blame me for listening to rumors when it is all I have to listen to," Will flared, wincing when his head began to throb with more insistence from the volume of his voice. "I was never even told she existed, Hannibal. The world believes you killed her, and I am left with nothing but pieces to put together as they fit."
"And they fit in the shape of my killing her,"
Hannibal said, and turned away, rubbing his face, weary resignation falling over him in a way that made Will's tension fall in turn.
"Shall I tell you another story? One to set your mind at ease, perhaps? Or merely confirm that I am, in fact, just the monster you imagine?"
Will shivered in the bath sheet, fingers so tight on the side of the tub his knuckles burned white. Hannibal swung back to face him, the stitch wound on his cheek livid against his skin, amber eyes unhappy and angry, but filled with something else that Will's gut told him was guilt.
Or perhaps it is suitable that you imagine me precisely as I am. A man who sends his young spouse out alone in his night clothes with no protection. A man who has killed as many men in a war as he has saved. And a man who has gutted his first wife like a felled doe in our marriage bed.
Will flinched from the statement, from the sudden and brutal picture it brought to his mind. Blood, fear, and anguish, frantic screams streaking across his imagination like fingers of lightning, a brief illumination of a possibility that shook him to his soul. Yet, as it had with Molly and Duxbury, even hearing it from Hannibal's own mouth couldn't stem the sliver of hope that Hannibal was innocent, that the world was wrong, that his husband was, beneath it all, just a man like any other, and not the monster he seemed or claimed to be. "You're deliberately trying to frighten me," he said, feeling it through his bond, latching onto Hannibal's words to find the holes he had left behind, gaping emptiness of events that he pared away to leave himself culpable. "Why are you telling me this way? What happened to her, Hannibal? Why do you feel so guilty?"
"I am guilty, Will,"
Hannibal said, and stood trembling before him, fists clenched and chest heaving with short, sharp breaths. The forceful maelstrom of emotion drained slowly out of him, leaving only abysmal grief and that terrible sense of wrong.
"You should be afraid of me."
"Don't lie to me," Will said, clenching his teeth against the pain in his head that shot down his shoulders, aching and deep. "I have never lied to you, Hannibal, and you will not lie to me in turn. Tell me the truth."
"What possible difference could it make now? The worst has happened, and you have nearly been killed because you fear me,"
Hannibal said, dropping his gaze to the floor, fists unclenching.
"Once again I failed someone I should have protected. At least you didn't die because of it. I suppose that makes you a rarity of one."
Hannibal crossed the washroom in 3 quick strides and wrenched open the door to Will's suite, intent on his plans to keep his mate safe, and shouted for Jimmy to go fetch Berger, the boom of his voice loud enough that it was entirely likely Mr. Berger heard him without Jimmy having to do so. The valet, very wisely, however, did as he was told. Will stared at him through the ache in his head, reading his pain and his upset, reading the Dilper guilt that seemed to permeate him, at odds with the bone-deep regret that saturated his bond. "What happened to her, Hannibal?" Will asked, the shiver from the cold giving way to feverish heat and an unsettling lurch from his stomach. "Tell me what really happened to her, and I will give you the benefit of the doubt. I want answers. I want you to talk to me." He swallowed hard at the startled flare of hope he saw in Hannibal's amber eyes, at the sudden surge of it he felt through his bond, and said with less force, "You should have told me long before now."
"When? Over tea and scones? During all of the many long hours we spend together?"
Hannibal scoffed and snorted with disdain, still chuffing with protective fury.
"Believe it or not, Will, I did plan on telling you, but I certainly won't do so in the middle of your bath while there is a killer lying in wait for you. Regardless of your current feelings for me, you are my spouse, and your safety is my foremost concern."
Will watched Hannibal move back through the washroom to his own suite, feeling less sure of his suspicions and more sure that Hannibal was genuinely and deeply distressed by what he'd told him. The understanding that his fears might have been mislaid untangled a twisted jumble of isolation and hopelessness inside of him, filling him with a relief he couldn't quite keep out of his voice when he called out to him, "You truly do not wish I was dead?"
"No, gods, no!"
Hannibal bellowed, frustrated and angry because too much time had passed now to properly figure out who had actually rigged Will's saddle or violated the safety of their home. He yanked the bell-pull by his bed for good measure, and returning to the washroom to stand in the doorway, eyes blazing.
"Had I any idea that you had been so threatened in our home, Will, I would have packed you away from here in a heartbeat. When I find out who is responsible for this, and I will find out, I cannot guarantee that I will hold my temper. They are certainly going to pay in full for the pain and fear they have caused you. I can promise you that."
It felt as if the weight of the entire world lifted from Will's heart, Such simple words with such profound effect, accompanied by Hannibal's protective alpha anger, made Will feel safer than he had in years. The dark, ugly knot of sick fear and distrust uncoiled from Will's heart with slow degrees of relief. He had no one but this alpha that his instincts had formed to so long ago, and the knowledge that Hannibal tried to kill him had hurt ways which he couldn't bear to address. But now he was no longer standing alone against an unseen enemy, with no resources and nowhere to turn. Hannibal was there with him, with all of his alpha strength to lend in his defense.
"We shall have to take measures,"
Hannibal said, thinking aloud, distracted and frustrated and practically growling.
"It is unacceptable that we are not safe in our beds. Everything about this is unacceptable."
"I asked Mr. Hawkes to be more vigilant with who had access to the house," Will said, eyes sweeping closed with the force of his relief, the enormity of it even eclipsing the pain he was feeling, if only for a moment. "I worried that your grandfather would be in danger."
"Yet you are not worried for yourself?" "Don't answer that, please. I would only be burdened by it."
Will said nothing, still absorbed in the growing understanding that Hannibal was not intent on seeing him dead, by the hope that he hadn't murdered his first wife as everyone assumed, though Will had a good many questions on that count.
"I cannot fathom what you were thinking. Your mind is such that I have great difficulty believing you could ever be remotely thoughtless, yet thoughtless you have been,"
Hannibal said, hands on his hips, beside himself with disbelief and surging protective anger. He was at a loss, uncertain how to protect Will when Will refused to be protected. Worse, when Will thought he was what he needed protection from.
"Where the seven hells is he? I refuse to tolerate this."
"I suppose there's nothing to be done about it now," Will said, fumbling the bathing sheet around when his words drew his husband's agitated, unsteady attention. He managed to cover himself from nape to ankles, but he did not try rising from the empty tub. He did not at all trust himself to get out of it now. He'd very nearly gone head first into the floor trying the first time.
"Nothing. Have you taken leave of your senses completely?"
Hannibal asked, looking fairly fierce as he glared down at Will, who managed to gaze back up at him with that damnable composure of his, glassy-eyed and woozy.
"You will— No, I have no reason to explain this to you."
"Hannibal," Will called, wary when he strode from the washroom once again, leaving the door to his suite standing wide. He clutched the side of the tub and leaned over, calling, "Hannibal, what are you going to do?"
"I cannot trust you with your own safety!"
Hannibal shouted and yanked fiercely on the valet call rope by his bed, much more vigorously than he had before, no doubt waking a clamour downstairs loud enough to scare the dead in Duxbury.
"You are reckless and thoughtless and haven't a care for yourself. If I leave you to your own devices, you'll be dead by the end of the month, nay, by the end of the week."
Will subsided, a thoughtful frown on his face. With force enough to be heard over Hannibal's dark, angry muttering, he said, "I don't like the sound of that."
"I am entirely disregarding your preference in this matter, Will,"
Hannibal said, appearing in his line of sight looking quite unsteady and angry, his scent a flagrant warning that he was in full flush to fight, and damn the consequences. It teased Will's nose and pooled in his belly, making his fingers and toes curl a little, as if the scent was something he could wrap around himself and delve into quite happily.
"I am your husband, and you will do as I say."
The words acted like cold water on that warm feeling, and Will drew up, offended. Before his better sense could catch up with his temper, he shouted, "Like hell I will!" He rose like Venus from the sea, and those playful little spots at the corner of his eyes unhelpfully converged on him all at once. Hannibal saw the blood drain from Will's face, and saw him start to buckle. In an instant he was there, rushing to catch Will up and swing him from the tub, bulky sheet and all. "I'm going to be sick," Will said, in the cautious, quiet tones of someone who very much meant it, his back and shoulders flaring with pain, even as gentle as Hannibal was with him.
"It's that damn knock you took,"
Hannibal said, careful not to raise his voice, his anger evaporating to deep concern. He eased Will down next to the basin and held him there. When Will bent his head to the porcelain, Hannibal took the chance to smooth his damp curls back and take a closer look at his head. He was distracted from his inspection by Berger, coming in at last, and called,
"Berger, have cook make some weak tea and porridge. Bring it up with some ice as quickly as possible."
"Please don't trouble yourself," Will said, the urge to be sick passing in increments now that he wasn't moving so rapidly. He felt the warmth of Hannibal's body around his, and relaxed slightly, some of his pain easing with the loss of tension.
I will trouble myself and everyone else all I like, thank you very much. Considering how little trouble you are most times, I think we can manage well enough just now. Do you need to be sick?"
"No, I think it passed." He growled softly when Hannibal scooped him up, his brow furrowing with irritation as he was carried into his husband's suite.
"The nausea is brought on by movement,"
Hannibal said, depositing Will neatly against the pillows, half sitting up in his bed.
"As you have undoubtedly realized, you need to lie quietly. Keep your eyes closed as much as you can."
Will didn't. He slit his eyelids despite himself to see Hannibal moving from window to window, drawing the heavy drapes closed against the brightening sunlight, leaving the room in near total darkness. The flare of a match was followed by the sharp scent of sulphur as Hannibal lit a lamp and turned it down to a low, bare flame that still seemed achingly bright in the darkness. When he returned to the bed, Will unconsciously clutched the bath sheet tighter and closed his eyes again, wincing when the bed shifted with his husband's weight. He felt the soft brush of calloused fingers against his brow as the lump was again exposed, and the unexpected brush of Hannibal's thumb over the wrinkle in his brow, accompanied by the gruff admonition,
"Being cross won't help your headache."
"I'm not cross," Will said, eyes fluttering open with less pain than before. "I am thoughtful."
"That is certainly true,"
Hannibal admitted, seated alongside Will's hip, fingers moving to linger in Will's curls, warm and gentle.
"Try not to be too terribly thoughtful, Will. Rest is what fixes this particular problem. I've seen these types of injuries before."
"I know. I've read your contributions to the Capital Medical Journal. Not that I am any wiser, mind you. For an entry that occupied so many pages, it offered surprisingly little insight into the matter of concussions."
See, you're already more yourself.
Will offered a rueful, reluctant chuckle at that, resisting the urge to turn his head against Hannibal's touch. Those long fingers moved softly against Will's scalp, lifting goosebumps on his skin. He was checking, Will knew, checking for other lumps, other cuts, yet even knowing the intent behind the touch didn't lessen the effect. It eased him, reaching deeper than the surface to find the tension that had hardened him since childhood. It annoyed him that something so insignificant could make such a profound difference without Hannibal even being aware of it, and he summoned a glower to look up at his husband. Much to his surprise, Hannibal gazed down at him with an expression he'd never chanced to see before. Softness, perhaps? A fondness? A concern? Worry? Will had no idea how to interpret it. He'd never had to do so before now.
"Most of my observations into such injuries were made on the battlefield,"
Hannibal said, and when those ugly memories assaulted him, as they so often did, he found the heat of Will's skin and the soft, soap-sweet scent of him made them lose their sharpness. He checked Will's eyes, noting the reaction of his pupils, murmuring,
"War is not all gunshots, impalements, and cannon blowback. I've seen a good many knocks such as this, though recovery vastly varies, and war is hardly conducive to proper observation."
A slight, amused smile curved his mouth, the light gleaming across the stark height of his cheekbone and just barely lighting the edges of his lips.
"Knowing your resilience, Will, you'll be back on your mare come morning."
Will laughed softly at that, a light sigh escaping him when Hannibal's thumb traced the arch of one eyebrow. He cleared his throat to cover it, and reminded him, "It is important to be useful."
"Believe me, you've been a tad more than useful,"
Hannibal told him, dropping his hand, but with great reluctance. Berger returned then, bearing a lovely tray with the requested weak tea.
"The porridge takes a bit of time, my lord,"
he said, cautiously pouring a cup for Will.
"I'll bring it up as soon as it's done. Berger, tell Mr. Hawkes I wish to speak with him later on the subject of house security. And tell Peter I expect to see him directly after."
"Hannibal, no!" Will protested, groping to put a restraining hand on his husband's arm, imploring, "There must be some reasonable explanation. There's no cause—"
"You've been hurt, Will, which is all the cause I need to do what I feel is necessary to secure your safety. And considering you think I am the culprit, I am not going to rely on your definition of reasonable. Berger, do as I say at once."
"Yes, my lord," Berger said, immediately on his way.
"Thought you were the culprit,"
Will murmured, accepting the teacup cautiously when Hannibal handed it to him. Hannibal blew out a soft breath of relief and asked,
"Do you believe that I am not at fault?"
"I think you are at fault for a good many things, Hannibal. But I no longer think you tried to kill me." "Your reaction alone reassures me.
Even you must surely lack the guile to perform with such conviction." "In which case will you allow me to examine you?"
Hannibal asked, his amber eyes flickering over Will's sturdy little body there in his bed, his worry clear in the weight of his gaze. When Will's brow furrowed up again, he hastened to say,
"At least let me make sure you haven't broken any bones. You must be bruised to an inch."
"My inches are not up for inspection," Will warned him, taking a sip of his tea, eyes closing for a long moment as his aches and pains warned him he might not be as well as he wanted to be. With caution and hesitance, he said, "It might be wise to allow you to offer your professional opinion, on one condition."
"Name it."
Hannibal's mouth quirked at the corners, the barest hint of a smile. "Tell me about her," Will said, setting the teacup aside. "As you intended to, Hannibal. The whole truth of it. You owe me that." Hannibal reached out and smoothed his hair. The heavy uneasiness in him lessened somewhat by the strengthening scent of Will's skin, by the silken feel of his curls, by the gentle readiness for acceptance he could sense.
"I owe you far better than you've gotten from me so far, Will. You have a vast capacity for goodness in you that I lack,"
he said, fingers falling to Will's neck, lightly stroking his skin. He pulled away with a sigh and folded a cloth over the ice Berger had brought him.
"I do not wish to test that. My behavior regarding Melinda does me no credit."
"Your willingness to speak of something which shames you does you credit, Hannibal," Will breathed, eyes closing when Hannibal gently pressed the ice pack to the lump on his head. A deep breath gave him Hannibal's alpha scent, the sharp warning tone softening as he calmed. It brought another warm ripple to his lower belly, slumberous and faint, but potent. "Truth has many sides, and we each prefer a side of our own choosing, but I would hear yours in the matter."
"May I ask first how you heard about Melinda?"
Hannibal asked, letting Will's slender fingers replace his own on the pack. He moved down to Will's long feet, to bare his legs to his knees, wincing at the smattering of purple bruises he'd gathered on his shins and knees. Will toyed with the lip of his sheet with his free hand, nervous as Hannibal began at his toes, gently testing the digits. His skin tingled, foot twitching in response to the ticklish touch, as his husband's capable hands moved firmly over him, seeking any sign of tender response. His own curiosity if Hannibal intended to move up his entire body in such a manner brought heat flaming into his cheeks, making him even more grateful for the ice on his head. He blurted rather than said, "I met her sister Molly in Duxbury. She was kind enough to tell me her story."
"Molly Foster,"
Hannibal murmured, thinking of that young blonde woman Will had lunched with. He laughed once, short and sharp, trading one foot for the other, Will's curled and unharmed little toes forsaken for his delicate ankles. His physician's mind catalogued the movement of bones and ligaments, but the alpha in him marveled at the solid feel of his mate in his hands, an intriguing mixture of delicacy and honed muscle that woke an unusual itch in him for more.
"She was barely 4 years old at the time, perhaps less even. She was born while I was away at medical school. She couldn't possibly recall much of what happened."
"She didn't, but gossip and conjecture filled in the details she lacked," Will said, subsiding against the pillows under Hannibal's gentle touch. He lay unresisting as his shins were inspected, each delicate brush of Hannibal's fingers on his skin vibrating through his nerves like a plucked harp-string, thrumming and true. "She told me that you broke Melinda's heart, that you swept her away when she was barely grown and eloped with her, that within a month she was dead and in the ground, her death a mystery quieted with your grandfather's money."
"The lauded opinion of a child not quite 5 years of age,"
Hannibal said, and sighed, his attention shifting to Will's bruised knees, finding them tender, but not displaced, and fairly painless upon movement. He got up and went to his bag, still there on his vanity, and dug out his arnica salve. He searched Will's young face as he returned to his place, taking in his sleepy expression, woozy blue eyes, his tousled, damp curls, and the aching vulnerability that had always been there before him. He'd just been too blind to see what Will's strength was protecting before now.
"I had hoped once to never have this conversation,"
he murmured, dabbing the salve on Will's bruises with light, soft strokes.
"I was a fool to think the former Lady Clarges would remain a secret, but now that I have the chance to tell you, I hardly know where to begin."
Will took a steadying breath, preparing himself for the worst, the spectre of his father in his dark heart whispering that the truth would crush even so tentative a faith as his, that Hannibal was everything Will feared he might be, that he would always be disappointed, always be betrayed. But even deeper still was something his father had never been able to pare out of him. Hope. Ugly and awful and frightening in its capacity to grow, heedless of all consequences. Whatever the outcome, he knew he had to abandon expectation and simply seek the truth. After everything that had happened, they both were owed a little honesty.
Molly's story was true in most respects. Melinda and I were best friends from childhood, inseparable despite grandfather's disapproval. I would not heed him. You must find it hard to imagine such a thing,
Hannibal said, uttering a low, wry chuckle, concentrating on applying the salve to Will's bruises.
I went away when I was 16, packed off for early entry to medical school. I wrote her every single day. Even knowing that my grandfather had a contract with yours, I promised myself I would marry her, and we would be terribly happy, and nothing would ever trouble us again.
Will's heart ached for him, seeing Hannibal there in his imagination, young and happily in love, doting on a young blonde very much like Molly, finding hope in life after the terrible loss of his family, starting a new career as a doctor with a bright future ahead of him. The potential made Will's throat constrict with emotion, a life yet unlived, memories yet unmade, the promise of things that never came to be. If there was anything that Will could understand to its depths, it was an unfinished life.
I returned earlier than planned on holiday to surprise her. She surprised me instead.
Hannibal, Will said, blinking hard against the tears that threatened, feeling too keenly through his balm the things that Hannibal's ingrained stoicism would never reveal. He barely noticed when Hannibal tucked the sheet up to bare one long thigh, grimacing at the bruises there.
If you truly do not wish, it's far past time I say it,
Hannibal said, careful to keep Will's groin covered as he checked both of his legs and hips, satisfied that he had no palpable fractures, only deep bruises that he began to cover with salve.
Perhaps it will help you see me more clearly.
Hannibal's hands on his thighs bled into Will's awareness, bringing blushes in their wake. His husband's professionalism made it less embarrassing, but Will still shifted and tried to sit up straighter in an effort not to feel so exposed. The movement rippled down his spine, from his nape to his tailbone, a terrible pain that made him wince, and prompted Hannibal to gently touch his waist, warning, "This may pain you, Will, but I suspect you might have broken a rib or two." "No, it's just an ache," Will said, a bit breathless when Hannibal shaped his torso through the sheet, carefully feeling his way up Will's body, testing and gentle. Will winced, relieved when nothing shifted, and Hannibal seemed satisfied, though reluctant to pull his hands away.
"You're remarkably resilient, not a break on you. Jimmy should bind them during the day. I'll let him apply the salve for you. Here, let me check your spine."
Will followed his lead, letting Hannibal shift him around on the bed onto his belly, a pillow hugged underneath him to cradle his bruised ribs and head, the ice pack propped carefully so as not to press on the painful spot. Hannibal settled at his side, a warm, weighty presence next to him, one hand on Will's nape in a gentle pressure that shifted to soft kneading, his sensitive fingers finding the ache with unerring accuracy.
"It will help the headache,"
Hannibal said, not wishing to be misunderstood. There had been entirely too many misunderstandings between them already. Will focused with sudden sharpness on the warm, sure hand kneading his nape with such gentle caution, not in an attempt to control him, but to heal him. It bothered him that even so well-intentioned and impersonal a thing could affect him with such deep immediacy, and he found himself confounded by his omega nature yet again, unsure how to counter it, even if he even wanted to. So many long, lonely years without comfort made it very difficult to resist. Hoping to distract himself, Will whispered, "How did she surprise you, Hannibal? What was it that set such sad circumstances into motion?" Hannibal smiled, a taut and unhappy smile that he used to cover all manner of disquiet.
"It was to be my last year in medical school. I managed to escape a few days ahead of schedule, and when I came home I went straight away to a place where we always met in secret, in hopes of finding her there. And she was. I discovered her naked in the arms of her lover."
Will flinched, the image hitting him like a slap in the face.
"I cut off contact entirely, naturally,"
Hannibal said, leaning over him, moving both hands to Will's shoulders to knead away the pain.
"I left her behind, spent a sorry few weeks with grandfather, then returned to finish my schooling, and resign myself to the understanding that I had made a serious error in judgment. She wrote me for months afterwards, letter after letter that I returned unopened, until one day I received one from her father, telling me Melinda was about to give birth to my child and demanding some action on my part.
Will remained silent, feeling Hannibal's anger like a burning brand within him, but it was overshadowed by the rupturing hurt it tried so desperately to hide. This girl, this child bride he'd had such hope in, had landed him a blow that had fractured him down to his soul.
I read the next letter that she sent me, begging me to rescue her from her thoughtless actions, pleading that I remember our fast friendship and extend my protection to her.
Hannibal said, sightless eyes fixed on Will's soft and tousled damp curls, but seeing only the damning words on the pages she had written.
Her lover had abandoned her, as they so often do, so she chose to lay it all squarely on my shoulders, trusting that our friendship would save her.
You did save her, didn't you? Rather, you tried, Will softly said, feeling the tension crawl down Hannibal's arms and settle in the hands on his body. You loved her too much to leave her in such wretched straits.
Did I? Perhaps I did. Perhaps that was it, what compelled me to return and hide Melinda and her coming child beneath the blanket of my position. When I came for her, I found that she had tried to rid herself of the baby through unspeakable means, but only gained an infection from the attempt.
He murmured, cautious in his anger not to hurt his little mate, tenderly easing his hands down the ditch of Will's spine, and up again, chasing the tension away with his inspection, the unevenness his hands encountered lost in the texture of the sheet as it shifted and bunched.
She was so very ill. The infection had gone into her blood. She was in great pain when I reached her, and I feared the damage that had been done to the baby through her rash actions.
She was frightened, Will breathed, feeling the panic of her situation, the future that stretched ahead of her in abysmal loneliness, shunned by her neighbors and shamed for her youthful indiscretion. The only reason it didn't entirely overcome him was due to the gentle pressure of Hannibal's hands on his shoulders and back. It is such a harsh price to pay for such a trespass. Her parents knew of the attempt?
That is how they discovered her circumstances,
Hannibal said, focusing on the feel of Will's body beneath his hands, the warmth he gave off, the suppleness of his muscles. The more he touched him, the more aware he became of his own calm. He knew from an intellectual standpoint that it was a natural occurrence between an alpha and omega, thanks to Bedelia's instruction. He just hadn't expected to feel it so keenly or so deeply, as if merely touching Will was an action he could continue forever and feel perfectly completed by. It made it less painful to continue confessing his sins, and he drew a deep breath to say,
I told Melinda I would rescue her reputation on the condition she admit to her mother and father the child was not mine. She did so, eager to be unburdened, eager to find a way out of the mess she'd found herself in. They were stunned, but very quickly saw that their livelihood was at stake. They were simple people, with good, simple lives, and her conduct shocked them, but they were grateful for my intervention. I took her north and married her.
I thought Melinda was a princess and he was taking her away to a royal castle.
Grandfather was furious, of course,
Hannibal said, a dark chuckle escaping him as he went to work on Will's fragile neck again, smoothing his thumbs up to the base of his skull.
He threatened to disown me on the spot, raged about the contract he'd made, demanded I annul the marriage. He was far too smart to think the baby was mine, and accused me of throwing away my future for childish fantasies. We eventually agreed that I would send her and the child to the country and never set eyes on either of them again. But he needn't have worried. She succumbed to her infection just a few days after her 16th birthday.
He fell silent, and Will took a deep, shuddering breath, feeling the warm weight of Hannibal's hands slide down to his shoulders. He wanted to weep for him, a disillusioned youth still so deeply in love that he would risk the ire of his family and his very position just to rescue her.
I had to cut her open to save the baby. A little girl.
Will felt a lurch in his heart at that quiet statement, a world of horror pared down to such a simple sentence, to describe something even Will's vivid imagination had difficulty wrapping around, cutting into the body of a loved one, or else lose two instead of one. Did she live?
She lived,
Hannibal said, resuming his gentle massage of Will's back. remembering the moment when he had held her, his fingertips brushing the soft, round cheek of Melinda's newborn daughter.
There wasn't a mark on her, though she was weak from the state her mother had been in.
What happened to her? Will breathed, grateful for Hannibal's warm touch as he worked both hands down the loosening muscles of his back, firm but tender. It eased the sharp bite of his imagination, somehow both calming and feeding that warmth within him, as if such soothing attention could hold it at bay. Is she close?
No, I honestly don't know. Grandfather had to step in. I was useless with shock and grief. He sent the baby away to be raised when the Fosters could not take her. At my insistence, he gave her family a settlement to lift them from poverty and allow Melinda her place in the family cemetery. I left the moment I could get away, fled to the military and left the country, the only thing I could think to do to get as far from her as possible.
She hurt you, Will whispered, knowing there was something more, something that Hannibal had still not told him. His flight tasted of guilt and anguish and soured adoration, an overpowering wave of oppression that had flooded him to foreign shores.
She begged me for my forgiveness. As she lay there in pain, striving to last long enough that she might bring her daughter into the world, she confessed that she had wronged me, that she had been frightened and had turned to me because she trusted me, and I had never failed her. She begged me to forgive her, and I refused.
Will's head came up and he turned slightly, just enough to see Hannibal's handsome face set in lines of pain and self-reproach.
She wept and pleaded for me to forgive her, and I refused her,
he said again, trying to make it solid in his memory, in his heart. That had been the start of it, Will knew. That was what had made those walls go up, thicker and stronger than before. Melinda had been the first to breach them after Lady Murasaki, after losing Misha, and her betrayal had taught an impressionable young man that the lessons he'd learned as a child were all true. They were the very same lessons Will knew to their depths. There was nothing good or honest in the world, no kindness left unpunished, no feeling left unspurned, no way to take back what was said or done, or say the things that should have been said. It was little wonder this man was before him, divorced in so many ways from what others took for granted, lashing back at the world while Will removed himself from it. Two vastly different responses, each as destructive and unchecked as the other.
She died mere moments after I did so. I stole her hope and let her die thinking I hated her,
Hannibal whispered, seeking the comfort of touching his mate without realizing it, the brush of his hands changing to a caress that twined up into Will's fragrant silken curls.
She was just a child, just a frightened, silly child, and I let her go in such a terrible way.
You were little better than a child yourself, Hannibal, Will said, his understanding of his husband finding a broad new wing where the weeping shadow of Melinda Lecter drifted. She was in a hopeless situation that grew more desperate by the hour, and you did what you could to mend it. When we are wounded and cornered, we strike out. We strive to walk in the footsteps of saints and martyrs, but we are merely human, Hannibal. You had no control over her decisions.
No, I didn't. But had I been a better man, she would never have sought such disreputable company. Had I come at her first letter, she would never have sought out that back-alley butcher. Had I returned sooner, I could have cleared the infection she contracted from it. Had I put aside my anger at her, she might have found the strength to survive.
Looking back at what might have been is a dangerous pastime, Hannibal. We have all been in situations where we wish things might have gone differently, fantasies where we changed the course of our world through one correct word or one right action. It is a fiendish torture. There is no return to what has been. There is no reversing time to bring teacups back together again, however much we lament the shattering. Hannibal flinched from that soft, quiet statement, Will's surety and man's stagnant nature sliding like a knife between his ribs. Melinda was dead and gone from him, and all the mistakes he had made lost to a past that would vanish with his own death. But Will was before him, with his keen understanding and valiant strength, not so far from his reach that he could not touch him, not so lost that he could not win him back and make amends for what had passed between them. If there was anything to be learned from shattering a teacup, it was to be more careful next time around.
I am as foolish now as I was then. The lessons that she taught me I could not bear to benefit from.
Hannibal quietly admitted, brows drawing down in a frown when his soothing hands felt a knot that seemed out of place on Will's back.
Her last moment on this earth was spent trying to reach me when I could not be reached.
It was a terrible thing, Will said, thinking of the rumors and lies that had followed Hannibal like a shadow for 16 years, unchallenged by him because to vindicate himself would be to expose Melinda's secret. I wish it had not happened to you. I wish none of this had happened to you. He too was a problem pushed onto Hannibal's hands, a marriage forced despite his wishes, a spouse with burdens he neither asked for nor wanted. I understand now why you were so livid, he breathed, lost in the reflection of Hannibal's perception, feeling the experience of their first few days of marriage from his husband's point of view all over again, but with a few facets. Home from the horrors of war, eager to see your family and start your life all over again? And your grandfather punished you for your disobedience by giving you me. Twice married by circumstances outside of your control, both times to people who gave you grave offense.
You do not offend me, Will,
Hannibal whispered, brushing his hand down Will's spine and back up to his shoulders. Every bit of Will seemed to freeze in the wake of that soft statement. Even his heart seemed to skip a beat, rattling to find a new rhythm that might somehow find such a thing to be true.
You confound me. You amaze me. You infuriate me, and sometimes even cosh me. But you never offend me.
Will bit his lip, eyes closing against the tender touch, against the softness of Hannibal's words, against the way he turned the smallest flicker of light on the darkness of Will's isolation that had drained him slowly but surely, the steady drip of his soul from the cracks left behind in the wake of his father's and husband's careless handling. Hannibal concentrated on rubbing Will's back, tracing that strange knot that chased across Will's skin in a most unusual fashion, palpable even through the bunched material of the bathing sheet. He slipped his finger into the lip of the sheet, intending to tug it down only far enough to have a look at that odd knot, saying, "I'll write it in a moment, Will. There's something that isn't—" He cut off, and Will froze, heart pounding as the sheet was slowly drawn down to his hips. It pulled from his nerveless fingers, turned back to bear him all the way to his pelvis, the airlifting goose-flesh on his exposed skin. "Will," Hannibal breathed, and Will squeezed his eyes closed, taking a shallow, stuttering breath, knowing what his husband was seeing. Scars. Scars crossing and recrossing the fragile expanse of Will's skin from his shoulders to the dimples above his bottom, all shapes and sizes, some stretched out by time. A map of cruelty, testament to treatment Hannibal had never dreamed he might have been dealt. "Gods in heaven," Hannibal whispered, sitting back until his mind could make sense of it. This history of Will's childhood laid out in a pattern of layered, trailing pain-like brands on his skin. Will moved to pull the sheet up, but stilled when Hannibal touched his back, naked fingertips to bare skin. The touch was faint, a tracery of his scars so light he barely felt it, respectful of the pain he'd endured to bear them. Will trembled, aching with upset, confused by the relentless press of grief he could feel through his bond to Hannibal, horror and outrage and blazing, righteous indignation. His deep, secret heart was profoundly shaken when his husband leaned toward him, when both calloused hands settled with exquisite tenderness on his shoulders and traced the scars with care. "When you came to me that first night, Will, I remember seeing the marks on your side. I could not imagine that they were... I could never have imagined... this." Will swallowed hard, skin prickling beneath the touch as Hannibal took stock of him, seeing for himself the value his father put on an unwanted omega. "I would take these from you," Hannibal breathed, and Will shivered when he felt the heated puff of Hannibal's breath against his skin. The faint, reverent kiss between his shoulders forced Will's eyes to fly wide open, rapidly filling with tears he refused to let fall. "I would take all of these from you and bear them myself, Will, if only I could." "Hannibal?" Hannibal pressed his forehead to the place he'd kissed, one hand on Will's shoulder, exhaling softly over his skin. "It was your father, wasn't it?" he breathed, lifting his face enough to press another kiss to the base of Will's neck, right on the knob of his spine, soothing and full of regret, as if the tenderness of his touch could somehow erase the suffering such wounds had caused. "Yes," Will said, his voice throaty and low. A shiver flowed through him when Hannibal eased back, one large hand sweeping his skin from his nape to the dimple above his bottom.
I find that I am capable of murdering someone in cold blood after all.
The flat, quiet fury of that statement was as startling to Will as the words themselves. "What?"
"You heard me,"
Hannibal whispered, stroking Will's skin with both hands, taking up a soothing caress as if those horrid scars didn't inspire the disgust Will knew he surely must feel.
"I would murder him for what he's done to you, Will, and gladly."
Will said nothing, completely taken aback by his response.
"Any person, man, woman, or Omega who puts their hands on you ever in your life will answer to me,"
Hannibal said, the words delivered without flourish, a flat statement of fact that made Will's eyes widen with surprise, made his traitorous heart kick with a sudden lurch that brought his hand to press against his mouth, stifling the sound that threatened to erupt.
"Be it your father, or this unknown person trying to harm you, Will, I promise you that. And I always keep my promises."
Will shuddered, resisting everything in him that pulled him toward the Alpha touching him right now, tender and filled with regret. The same Alpha who had once scoffed at his responses, called him repulsive and stupid and sickening, who had followed in his father's footsteps and managed to wound him in a way that his father never could, by forging a bond that could never be broken, a mockery of what might have been. Will wet his lips and tugged at the sheet, attempting to cover his back, attempting to find what dignity was left to him now that Hannibal saw him as he truly was, damaged, weak, and insignificant. "You needn't concern yourself, Hannibal. You have always been very clear on your regard for Omegas, myself in particular. I will take care of myself. I always have."
"Will, I have treated you with unreasonable and unforgivable disregard,"
Hannibal said, slowly sliding his hands away, attuned to Will's deep turmoil.
"Please believe me. Had I known your circumstances, things would have gone much differently."
"For what reason? Would it have made me less Omegan? Or would you have thought it fitting to see me so shamed? Whatever feeling this moment has inspired in you, Hannibal, please extinguish it. I am not what you think I am."
"I would not have you be less Omegan, Will. I would not have you be anything but the person you are, and I would never wish to see you shamed or believe that any such treatment is fitting,"
Hannibal said, smoothing the sheet up over Will's shoulders, those scars imprinted on his memory, burned into his mind's eye along with the horrible understanding of what Will had suffered.
"What do you imagine I think you are, seeing what has been done to you?"
"Weak," Will said, his voice cracking on the sharpness of the word, a single syllable filled with loathing and fear, as if even speaking it aloud begat the possibility of truth. "I cannot bear being weak, Hannibal. I cannot bear being what I am."
"Abused?"
Hannibal asked, dropping his hands entirely despite the urge to soothe him, Will's growing distress pulling on his instincts in a way that was nearly impossible to resist. But instinct, he knew, was the heart of this matter, and he softly asked,
"Or Omegan?"
"Is it such a difficult thing for you to imagine?" Will asked, breathless with the force of his upset, the lessons of his life and the origins of his bond to this man coming to bear on him, forcing the words from his mouth despite the pain they caused him. "I have spent the entirety of my life lamenting the gender of my birth. It took my father years to make me understand how offensive I and others like me are to the world. Did you think that it was my dream to end up with someone who loathes me and everything I am? That I hoped to leave my father's house as I was and find myself just as despised, faced with a different type of violence that was no less painful?" Hannibal flinched, hands clenching into his fists in his lap, the memories of his first days with Will stark and harsh. "I earned those scars. Every one of them is proof that I was not betrayed into my nature. Each one is a moment of weakness that my father recognized and curtailed. He could not change my gender, but he ensured I would not fall victim to it. I am grateful to him, Hannibal. It is only due to his firm instruction that I am not a mindless bundle of instincts clinging to an alpha for succor." Hannibal heard the words, but more, he heard the meaning behind them, and knew he owed his fair share of blame. He had no idea how to ease him, but he wanted to. Will, however, was so deeply averse to his own nature that he would resist it, fight it, make himself sick rather than accept it, and he was far too ill already. Hannibal had condemned Will's Omegan gender, as if it had been a choice made to spite him rather than a natural state of being that could not be changed. He had unwittingly adapted Will's burgeoning Omegan nature to mirror his own prejudice, making him resentful of his own instincts, impatient with the qualities that made him who he was, and deeply disgusted with the way nature had designed him.
"I earned those scars,"
Will stiffly said again, refusing to cry, refusing to be weak, refusing to be those things his father had claimed to be beating out of him.
"Every single one of them is a lesson learned."
Scars on the inside, grandfather had said, and Hannibal saw for himself just how devastating that could be. He wet his lips and pitched his voice low to say,
"Then I disapprove of your education, Will."
"The last thing I need is your pity, Lord Claudius," Will said, moving suddenly in an attempt to escape the acceptance those words hinted at, or, perhaps, what his own nature hoped to trick him into believing was there. He got to his feet and stood swaying in place, the force of his pain threatening to tip him into darkness. But he refused to give in to it, and clenched his teeth on an exhale.
"That's a relief, as I would never pity someone who has risen so admirably against expectation to manage what you have managed,"
Hannibal told him, standing to steady him, his touch gentle and cautious, but there all the same, ready to offer support should Will suddenly find himself wavering. Will's upset eased a little at the gesture, just enough for Hannibal to tentatively offer,
"I understand now why you asked what you did. Believe me, Will, I would never treat any child of ours with the horrific cruelty and disregard your father treated you. That anyone could treat another human being with such callous sadism, let alone the precious gift that is their own child. It infuriates me. Hanging is too good for him. Drawing and quartering is too good for him. There is no amount of suffering he could endure that would purge him of his sins against you. A child is a treasure, our only true legacy. I cannot fathom the legacy he wished to leave in treating you this way, but your children will be deeply beloved."
Will stared at him, chest tight with something he could not recognize, Hannibal's sincerity finding the cracks in his walls and scaling them, threatening to breach the very thing meant to keep him at bay. Hannibal tipped his head up, sensing or scenting it, and Will blushed, suspecting that Hannibal's nearness and the stress of his situation was pushing his heat closer, despite the tonics he took. It would be, he knew, typically Omegan to react to so much constant dread with a call for an alpha. "Why do you want a child so badly?" Will asked, his intuition warning him that there was something he simply wasn't seeing, something which had brought his formerly reluctant spouse back after 6 years, determined to bed him.
"Why do you not?"
Hannibal asked, because he simply could not tell him, not now, not ever perhaps. How could he ever admit to what he had agreed to? If he had his way, he never would, not at the risk of losing Will all over again. His voice was barely better than a whisper when he asked,
"What kind of father would you be, Will?"
"I would be a good father."
"I think so too."
Will stilled, unresisting when Hannibal slowly eased closer. The tightness in his chest grew as his husband folded around him in a blanket of heat and scent, a surety of strength that promised a support upon which Will feared he could not rely. The cliff of his nightmares threatened to surface, the roar of his blood in his ears becoming the crash of waves on the rocks, hungry and waiting for him to be foolish enough to fling himself into the unknown. Hannibal's arms tightened around him, and Will caught his breath, the first tense touch of being held to his husband's chest giving way to slow acceptance. He closed his eyes, a sigh coming out of him despite himself as Hannibal embraced him, his hunger for even so small an affection ravenous and frightening in its strength. Hannibal cradled Will to him, one arm around his narrow waist, one arm sliding behind his shoulder to cup his head, urging Will to rest against him. He drew in a breath sweet with Will's scent, and closed his eyes, feeling Will's heart pound against his own, feeling the faint tremor that coursed through his taut body. He stroked his hand through Will's curls, nose buried against his unhurt temple, and simply held him.
"I promise you things will be different now. I promise you. Please stay, Will."
He breathed, careful not to squeeze him, careful not to overwhelm him, wishing he could reach back through time and shield him from the men who should have protected him.
"Please stay."
"Stay here in this room. Stay here in this house. Stay here with me." Will could feel something through his bond, feel that same something in the softness of Hannibal's words and the gentle caution of his touch. His arms trembled when he lifted them, the pain of his fall forgotten, forsaken for the overcoming pain of his father's ugly truths being challenged by the last man in the world he imagined would do so. He settled his hesitant hands against Hannibal's back and nodded, the barest concession. He wasn't prepared for the kiss on his temple, faint and brushing and tender. He wasn't prepared for the light squeeze around him, or the soft exhale against his ear when Hannibal breathed, "Thank you." They stood there in each other's arms, warm and uncertain, but reaching, peering through the murky waters of their past together, and a future that seemed impossible, all things considered. Eyes closed, tentative and raw with wounds from a battle yet far from over, Will found that it was just as much his own strength that was being sought as it was Hannibal's, that his husband's tense body eased in his arms with every breath, that there was as much giving in both of them as there was taking. They drew apart by degrees, and Will could feel Hannibal's reluctance to do so as he eased back. He gazed at his husband with confusion, trying to reconcile this moment with his bond, with everything that his experience knew to be true. Hannibal merely cupped his face, smoothing his cheeks with a crooked smile, before pulling away entirely. Will watched him, bewildered, as he moved to his wardrobe and plucked out a nightshirt, which he brought to his uncertain little mate.
"It will swallow you, very nearly, but it's better than that damp sheet,"
Hannibal said, noting the glassy look in Will's eyes, and knowing he was still in a good deal of pain.
"You must be chilled to your bones by now. It was thoughtless of me not to offer sooner."
"Thank you," Will said, automatic good manners bumping him out of his momentary stupor. He ducked a little when Hannibal draped the nightshirt over his head and let it fall into place, dropping the bath sheet as he fed his arms through the voluminous sleeves. It wrapped him in soft, cool folds that quickly warmed his body, cocooning him in Hannibal's comforting alpha scent in a way that made Will want to curl up into a little ball and purr himself to sleep.
"I'll get you something for the pain while the girls build the fire up," Hannibal said, as he knelt to pull the bath sheet away. He tugged the nightshirt down where it hung nearly to Will's slender ankles. He couldn't resist smoothing it, brushing his palms over his mate's pale, perfect calves, and the small knobs of his ankles, even down to his feet, which turned in ever so slightly in a way he'd never noticed before, but found profoundly charming. Will looked down at him, that odd tightness in his chest never lessening, the pressure, perhaps, of the wind atop that dark cliff luring him towards the drop. He never imagined being so close to the edge would feel like this, like promise and hope and potential. "Thank you." Hannibal's only answer was a gentle, relieved smile.